Welcome to the High Performance Disciple podcast. My name is Gareth Morgan, and my goal is to help you close the gap between your God-given potential and your daily performance. What I do is I explore the explosive combination of timeless spiritual principles and high performance practices that will enable you to take control, to be courageous, and to release the greatness that is in you. This conversation is designed to help high achieving, high impact leaders, entrepreneurs, athletes, and pioneers turn fear into faith, confusion into clarity, frustration into focus, and stress into strategy. If you enjoy what you hear, I would love for you to like it, to subscribe, to comment, and share it with others that you believe in. Here's today's conversation. Welcome to another episode of the High Performance Disciple podcast. I'm going to talk about a really important subject today, and the title of this episode is How to Win the Battle in the Mind. Anybody who is a high performer, high achiever in whatever sector, industry that you operate in day by day, you'll know that when it comes to high performance, producing the very best results, unlocking our deepest potential, that the biggest barrier in the way is our thinking. It's that space between our ears. It's the space in our minds. There are lots of things that we need to do externally to deliver the very best. Lots of strategies, lots of things that we can add to our day-to-day activities to enable us and to help us, but 80% of it is in our mind. And it's an area that can often feel like it's important, but we don't treat it like it's urgent. And yet actually many of the urgent, necessary things that we feel we've got to deal with on a day by day are caused by that battle in the mind. And so we don't necessarily invest consistently in our thinking and in what I call mind management. And yet the symptoms of not dealing with it are creating daily urgencies. So of course it makes sense then to flip it and to say, right, well, if I actually start to mind manage on a daily basis, then actually those urgencies aren't going to be happening as often because I am proactive rather than reactive. So let me share a little story with you because I like to share from experience and what I've learned on this journey of leadership, on this journey of being a high achiever myself, and of course failing often, but learning from those failures. So a failure that you learn from actually is turned into wisdom, which ultimately is more valuable than gold. Okay, so if you're going through a failure right now, you're sitting on a gold mine, providing that you learn from it. It was back when I went to university and I attended a college that was part of a university setup, and I went aged 18, first time away from home. And it was a term into the first year. And the first several weeks, brilliant, loved it. It was like the honeymoon period. Away from home, was able to do my own thing, that sense of independence, feeling properly grown up, and enjoying making new friends, and just enjoying a new, fresh routine, and doing something that I really love to do. But it was toward the end of that first term and then coming into the second half of that term that I really started to become aware that my thoughts could be really destructive. Let me explain what I mean. I started to realize that my thoughts were so powerful that they could make me think that I could do something that I really didn't want to do. I almost felt like I potentially was subservient, subordinate to my thoughts. Let me illustrate. So one of the things that started to happen is I started to become really anxious and fearful. Before I went to bed at night, I would worry that in the night I would do something to self-harm. And even worse than that, to do something that would endanger my life. And I didn't want to do that. It wasn't that I was intending to do that or planning that. It was just that I had this thought that, wow, what if, if I've had the thought that I could do that, then that means that I'm capable of doing that. And what happens if then I am not in control of that and that thought is in control of me? And it created all of a sudden this anxiety, and then that started to breed other thoughts, and suddenly I felt like I was dominated by negative thoughts. And it got me into a real state, to the point where I used to fear going to sleep at night. It would start to make me pull out of connecting with people and enjoying what I had enjoyed so far. And it started to cause me to isolate myself, because that's what fear does. Fear starts to get you to cut off anything that is life-giving. And then, of course, that self-perpetuates a negative state, because ultimately, when we share a fear, that fear is disempowered. So, of course, what we end up doing is not sharing that fear, and then that fear is empowered and becomes even more potent. But thankfully, I'm really grateful for parents who I've always been able to talk to about anything that has been challenging me. And I remember calling my parents and speaking, especially to my mum, about what was happening. It took a while, because at first it was like, this is weird. Like, I've never talked about these kinds of thoughts before. I've never had these thoughts before or struggled with them. But one of the things that my mum did is she met up with me. We went out for some food, and she brought with her, written down on a number of small notes, Bible verses. And verses that were particularly, specifically targeted at fearful thoughts. And she was saying to me essentially this: when those thoughts come, and they will and they do, which, number one, was comforting, because at that moment I thought I was the only one. And when it comes to the battle of the mind, and thankfully we talk a lot more these days about mental health and about our thoughts, etc. But it's still amazing how we can believe the lie that I'm the only one, and I am strange for having these thoughts or having this struggle. You're not, okay? You're part of the human race. It's a stage that we all hit. And actually, as you're going to learn from this conversation, it actually becomes something that we need to engage in proactively. But she said to me, you need to replace those thoughts. You see, our thoughts become our focus. What we focus on, we feed. If you imagine that thought being like a small animal, and if we keep feeding that animal, the animal is going to grow stronger and stronger and stronger and become more dominant. And at first it looks like a little puppy that wouldn't hurt anybody, but then it becomes like this lion. I've moved from dogs to cats there, but you know what I mean. It becomes this beast. And we keep feeding it by focusing on it. So what I've somehow got to do is I've got to change my focus. I've got to identify a thought that empowers me rather than disempowers me. And so I started to read these little pieces of paper that my mum gave me with these Bible verses on. And I literally would go to sleep at night with them in my hand and uttering them over and over and over again. And what I found was that when I focused on those words, what I focused, I fed, and that thought that I wanted to grow bigger and bigger became a thought that then could devour the other thoughts. All of a sudden I created an alternative creature, as it were, that could devour the fear. Faith then devoured the fear. And from that moment on, it was a period of several weeks, but I'm so grateful that I went through that. At the time I was, and at the time I hated it. It was disturbing, it was challenging. It made me feel weak. But what I learned through that period is we can go through weak seasons, but sometimes those weak seasons where we feel like we're fragile, like we feel we're not able to have the power or strength to keep on going, are actually seasons where we're being conditioned and strengthened for greater things. And so the dream that you have right now requires conditioning. I'm going to use another analogy in the moment that will speak to this whole idea of conditioning and conditioning of the mind. But I want to go to a part of the Bible. Again, this whole podcast is about combining spiritual principles with high-performing practices that have an explosive impact in terms of what we're pursuing each day. And so again, I will highlight the principle that if you're just looking at this from the point of view of, I want to learn the principles and values of what you're talking about, Gareth, as a code of success, then great, you can do that. Or if you're somebody who is a believer and you are somebody who has a faith in Jesus, then of course you have that covenant of significance, and this becomes not just a principle, but becomes part of your relationship with God. So I'm going to go to 2 Corinthians chapter 10, and this is what it says. The Apostle Paul says, "For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds." So let's just start with that first thought. And the first thought is this. Paul is helping the people that he was writing this letter to, which was a church, followers of Christ, in a place called Corinth, which is a city, and it was an economically influential city. And so he would have been speaking to people who were from all walks of life, both leaders in industry as well as people that would be workers, mothers, etc., children. They would have all been there listening to this letter as it would have been read out. And Paul is saying this. He's essentially saying, what you see around you is only part of the story. He says, "For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does." In other words, he's saying that the challenges that you see and that you look at with your eyes are ultimately not the challenges. Let me bring this to a real clear example. So, have you ever had somebody that you've really struggled with, relationship-wise? Maybe somebody in your team, maybe somebody that you've been leading, you've employed, or somebody that's coached you. Again, it could be different roles or relationships, but somebody that you've just really, really struggled with, to the point where it feels like that they really have it in for you. They would really want you to fail or to mess up, or even worse than that, to do you harm. What Paul is saying is, in that moment, you can think that they are the problem. And immediately the thought is, well, if they weren't there, then it would be a whole lot easier. But Paul is saying, like, they are just a reflection of the real problem. The real problem is not in what is seen, it's what is unseen. Paul is saying that everything that truly is essential to manage is not in what is seen, but in what is unseen. And ultimately, you can't control what other people think. You can't manage other people's minds, which is a good job. We have enough trouble managing our own. But what we have to do is manage our own thoughts. Because in that moment, I could be thinking they are the problem. But actually what Paul is saying here is that the spirit realm, in other words, the unseen realm, which is powered by ideas, ideals, and thoughts, is ultimately what is the root behind what is seen. It's what they are thinking in their mind that ultimately is generating their behavior. and somebody could have it in for me, but ultimately I'm not necessarily the problem. Now, if I am, I have to take responsibility for that, but the potential is that ultimately it is their thought process, their belief system that is the root problem. And so I can't do anything about that. But what I can do is decide what's going on in my mind, the meaning that I'm going to attach to that. I'm going to decide what this means. I'm going to decide how I respond to that. And Paul is saying here, don't get caught up in what is seen. Get caught up in managing your own thought process regarding what is going on. And so the first of 4 steps that I want to give you is this: turn up each day to the fight. Turn up each day to the fight. The most recent fight that I can think of that gives me an analogy here is the Tyson Fury fight. And based upon when you are listening to this, this is recorded a few weeks after Tyson Fury defeated Deontay Wilder in the 3rd of the trilogy of fights. And what's interesting about that whole trilogy, and especially kind of the before, the during, and the after, is that the preparation for the fight is key. The preparation for the fight, both that which is unseen, the private preparation, the gym, the training, the diet control, etc., is absolutely essential. But also the interactions in the face-offs and the communications before the fight. They're wanting not only to communicate to the other person that I am ready for this, but they're also communicating to themselves. They're getting their own mind ready. They're realizing I've got to turn up in fight mode. In fact, Tyson Fury said regarding this fight, I think he'd only seen his wife 2 weeks out of 6 months, and I think part of that was down to a family illness. He knew he had to be in the zone, completely in fight mode, as he calls it, and he knew that he had to turn up each day in that mode, not just on the fight day itself, but each day was a fight day. And you and I need to turn up each day to the fight. There may not be a war going on in what we can see. Hopefully you're not turning up to your office or turning up to your training ground or wherever you go each day and that literally there's war taking place. You're turning up to sometimes some very ordinary set of circumstances. But we have to turn up each day in the mindset that says that I am on a mind mission. I need to manage my mind. My mind needs to be prepared to deal with thoughts that are out to destroy me. So you proactively stay ahead of negative thoughts, because the truth is negative thoughts will come. I don't have to kind of suggest that they will, because we're human beings. The negative thoughts will come, but what we've got to do is proactively manage the garden of our mind. And what we have to do in that process is what Paul then goes on to say, which is the weapons we fight with are not the weapons of this world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. Paul is saying that strongholds are the effect of thoughts that aren't managed. What do you mean, Gareth? Well, a stronghold back in those days, and certainly historically, strongholds would have been like small castles or fortresses that would have been established as outposts for fighting forces. So if we were in a battle with another side, we'd create strongholds where the soldiers could gather within a set of walls that were fortified. And then they could go into those strongholds, but then they could come out of them and go and carry on the mission to destroy the enemy, and then gather again in another stronghold. They were places of safety where enemy forces could retreat into. So think about this. If I have a negative thought that isn't dealt with, over time it builds a stronghold. In other words, it builds a place of safety where that thought plus the fighting friends of that thought, because a thought that is focused on and fed will grow, it will multiply. And that thought gives birth to many more thoughts. And that stronghold then almost becomes a cluster of thoughts that becomes very difficult to shift, because a stronghold, by the very nature of its definition, is a place of strength that is established by an enemy force. And so if I don't turn up each day to fight, what happens is I start to make agreements with thoughts, and those thoughts then start to form strongholds. What do you mean by this, Gareth? Well, let me use this illustration. Have you ever signed up to a free trial for something? You know, you have these products that say, come and try us for 30 days, put your card details in up front, and providing you cancel before the end of the 30 days, you won't be charged a thing. Now, of course, that sounds great, but how many of us have done that and then forgotten 30 days later that we signed up? And then we've ended up paying maybe for 1 month or even longer, because out of sight, out of mind, and that payment, it has kicked in. What's happened is, because we haven't gone back and dealt with that original decision, we've essentially entered into an agreement. And that agreement, if we don't make another decision to deal with it, is a decision. It's a decision to keep it. It's a decision to keep on paying. Any thought, negative thought, and let me say this flips onto the positive as well, okay? But let me just focus on the negative to start with. Any thought that I don't deal with over time, I essentially enter into an agreement with. And I will pay the price of that agreement on an ongoing basis unless I change it. Unless I tear up the contract and I discharge the pact that I made with that thought. And Paul says here in verse 4 of this passage, he says, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And we take captive every thought and make it obedient to Christ. What Paul is saying here is we need to unleash the unseen power. The way to fight a negative thought, going back to my story, is to replace it with a powerful thought that we do want to see grow in our minds. So, for instance, when I had that verse that was given to me from my mum, one of the verses that she gave me was Romans 12, 1-2. And in the second verse there it says, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. In other words, when I went to bed thinking about that, and for me praying about that, I was recognizing I'm not going to conform to the pattern. And a decision not to conform is to conform. And so that verse was telling me, I choose right now to unleash a different thought that I'm going to create a positive stronghold on. And a stronghold is created by an agreement. Any thought that I agree with becomes an idea, that then becomes an ideal, which then becomes, ultimately, which we'll talk about in a moment, a conviction. And so we need to create outposts for an army that we want to see in our mind, that army that is going to empower us, that is going to defeat negative thoughts, that is going to overpower any disempowering ideas that we may have. And Paul here is saying is that we have this ability. Now, this is where, again, if I'm not a person of faith, I can choose the thoughts that I want to focus on and feed off those, and that will have an effect and that will have an impact. For me and my faith and my worldview, The power of my faith is that it's not just an idea I come up with. I believe the idea has an authority, and that authority is the God who created me. So I'm not just choosing a positive thought, but I'm actually choosing a thought that is connected to my design. Therefore, I know I'm aligning to God's original intention for my life. So again, for me, that just adds a huge amount of weight and power to the thoughts that I'm choosing. I'm not just selecting from a range of positive thoughts. I'm tapping into the intrinsic design of who I've been created to be. So I need to unleash that unseen power, which then enables me to take out, the third thing, to take out the enemy bunkers, those belief bunkers. That's what those strongholds are. They're strongholds of belief. They're beliefs that have where thoughts are bunkering down, and they are then able any moment to kind of run ravage throughout our psyche, and then once again to retreat and to gather. Have you noticed sometimes you just get a flurry of thoughts, and let me go back to my story, because there's a key here. Whenever we find ourselves in an uncertain moment or an uncertain season, that is when those negative thoughts come out of those strongholds. It's as if those negative thoughts seek to destroy our potential and our ability to perform, feed off moments of uncertainty. So whenever the results aren't going well, whenever we've entered into maybe a period of uncertainty that we've never experienced before, an unfamiliar set of circumstances. For me, I was away from home for the first time. This was a new experience, and that environment suddenly allowed some strongholds to run ravage, and things that I hadn't realized had been established in my thinking, those bunkers, needed to be taken out. And so that's when I realized, wow, how did those bunkers get established? And I realized that they get established when I'm not turning up to the fight each day, when I'm not unleashing the unseen power of the thoughts that I want to feed on. And then I need to proactively take out those enemy bunkers. Then finally, Paul goes on to say this. He says, and we will be ready to punish every act of disobedience once your obedience is complete. In other words, we'll be able to deal with anything that isn't in alignment with what I want to believe. So when my behavior doesn't match up with my belief, because I have that thought that I know is a powerful thought that I'm going to agree with. And this is what this sounds like, to be really practical. It all starts with who I believe I am. It always starts with identity. A powerful belief starts with, this is who I am. When something on the outside is uncertain, it is asking a question of my identity. Right, well now, who are you in this moment? It's not trying to prove me wrong, and it's not trying to discount me or count me as invalid. If anything, actually, it's trying to validate my identity, because Tyson Fury is a world champion because he was tested. And it's really interesting coming back to Tyson Fury. If you listen to some of his post-fight interviews, in fact, from both of the second and the third, he was knocked down in the second, I think once, flat out. And in the second, he was knocked down twice. So in the third, he was knocked down twice. And those moments, when you're knocked down, like, that's a moment of weakness for a boxer. But actually what happened with Tyson Fury is that in that moment, and again, actually Tyson Fury has a faith, and he would say, if you look at his post-match interviews, that in that moment, he felt and he knew he had a God who could raise him up from that canvas. And in that moment of being knocked down, he could choose to agree with one or two thoughts. First of all, the natural negative thought of, wow, didn't see that coming, maybe this isn't my fight. At the moment that he agrees with that, that sets off a pattern and a chain event that only ends up with one result, which is losing. Or he chooses to believe that this moment is going to reveal who he truly is. And that's what he did. He made a decision. No, I'm going to be up from this canvas, and this is what I'm born for. Again, he identifies in that moment his identity, and it's strengthened to a conviction to the point where now, if you and I ever see him in another fight go onto his back, we're not thinking he's out for the count. We'll be saying, I've seen this before. He'll get up right now. Why? Because that's what happens. A thought that somebody agrees with on a consistent basis becomes an expectation. Not only he then expects, I will get up from this because I've been here before 3 times with Deontay Wilder, and I get back up. That's what I do. That's who I am. Can you see? So that mindset, that battle in the mind starts with an I am, which then informs I will. It makes a decision of the will. I can change what I'm doing in this situation. I can come up with a different idea or strategy because right now everything seems to not be working. The circumstance is not stronger than the identity that I carry. The identity I carry is stronger than the circumstance. It just goes through a testing process that's going to prove it. So I want to encourage you right now, what you're going through is not there to discount you, it's to prove who you really are. And that's the final part, which is we need to reinforce our reasons. We need to reinforce our reasons. Any negative thought that comes your way, we can say, well, there's a reason I'm thinking that way because that's true. And the worst thing we can do with a fear is agree with it, to make that pact with it, to agree with its claim over our life. What we have to do is deal with it and say, no, I'm going to reinforce the reason why that thought has come and now what I'm going to do with it. This is who I am and this is the person I'm becoming. Therefore, this thought is going to be dealt with right now. It is not true. It is a lie. And therefore, I'm going to focus on what is true, what is going to empower me in this moment, which develops concrete convictions. What is concrete? It's a reinforced material. That's what we need to do, is reinforce our beliefs. Never rely on yesterday's reinforcement for today's strength. We need to daily turn up to the fight. This goes back to the beginning. And to turn up each day in fight mode. We're not fighting with other people. We're engaging in the battle of the mind because we're proactively going to stay ahead of those negative thoughts. Any negative thoughts are going to be regenerated to reinforce the reasons for why we have to keep going and we must keep turning up. So I really hope that some of what I've shared with you right now, turning up each day to the fight, unleashing the unseen power of those agreements that you're going to make, taking out the enemy bunkers, identifying what are those thoughts. Spend some time, again, practically, Gareth, what can I do? Well, I always encourage people, journaling is powerful. You may say, but Gareth, I'm not a person who sits down and writes. Well, who decided that you're not that person? Well, you did. So let's maybe challenge that. Maybe that's a belief bunker immediately. I'm not the kind of person who. Well, let's take that out maybe and say, well, I'm now the kind of person that is going to journal. Writing down for me every day, my thoughts, this is what I'm thinking, this is what I'm feeling. What is that thought? Where's that thought come from? Do I want that in my thought process? If I leave it, then I agree with it. I've entered the 30-day trial with it. It's going to become an ongoing cost to me. Do I want that? You can see here there's a process. And then to reinforce the reasons. Again, reinforce, this is who I am. If you want to go and check out garethmorgan.tv/winning conversation. Again, I help you with the process of identifying your I ams and your I will and your I can and your I have. Again, these are just ways of forming our thoughts as we intend to think, rather than just leaving it up to just the daily process of allowing our thoughts just to occur and to happen. It's like your garden. Final thought for you. If we just allow our garden to happen, it will be a mess. It will become an unruly and wild environment which won't be pleasant to spend time in. A garden needs to be managed. It needs to have the things that you don't want in there to be uprooted and removed. It needs the things that you want in there to be planted and to be watered. There's a management. It's a daily process. You can't rely upon last year's activity to deal with this year's management of your garden. So you can win the battle in your mind. It is crucial to your performance and what you're producing each day. And as always, you can take control. Be courageous and release that greatness that's in you. I hope today's episode was helpful to you. You can get more by subscribing to my channel, and I have more content and tools that can help you on your journey if you'd like to head over to garethmorgan.tv. Remember, today and every day you are a champion, and there is more in you than you think.